Hi, we're going to learn how to analyze poetry today. So, in order for you to analyze a poem, the first thing you're going to have to do, number one, read the poem. You have to read the poem. Read it a couple times, in fact. Listen to it being read to you and then read it yourself. After you've done that, you're going to use something called the SIFT method. So, the SIFT method is how we are going to analyze poetry. And each letter in the word SIFT stands for a different part of the poem that I want you to analyze. So let's start with the S. The first thing I want you guys to look for after reading the poem a few times is, of course, the symbols. What symbols do you see in that poem? A symbol, remember, is an object that represents something else entirely. So, for example, in Christianity, we have a cross to signify the entirety of our religion. So, it is a symbol that stands for what we believe in. Now let's take a look here at this slide. The dove flew ahead. Now in poetry and in literature, a dove usually is a symbol of peace. And so if a poet makes the deliberate purpose of including a dove in their poem, you can venture to guess and infer that maybe the author is writing something about peace or some sort of peace coming in eventually, etc. All of these um, analyzing of the symbols will help you determine the theme of the poem. So every single part of SIFT that we are analyzing will help you determine the theme. All right. So after you look at all of the symbols, you write out, you annotate what you think the symbols stand for, move on to the imagery. Imagery is descriptive language that makes you use one of your five senses. So these are the words that poets deliberately use to put images in your head to make you use your imagination. And it's not just poets that use this, we're just talking about poets right now. So, for example, I have the wind howled whipping through my hair. Not only does this allow me to imagine using my sense of hearing because I hear the wind howling, but I also have a sense of feeling. Everyone knows what their hair feels like when it's flapping in the wind and flapping in your face and all of that. So, the poet is now engaging you in having a feeling. After you've gone ahead and analyzed the imagery and found any incident of imagery in the poem, you're going to move on to the figurative language. Now, there are lots of different types of figurative language. For our purposes here, we're going to be focusing on similes, metaphors, and personification. There are more than just those three, okay? But we're going to be focusing on those. So, figurative language is anytime you're making a comparison, anytime you're using flowery language to bring animals or non-human objects to life, anytime you're adding sound effects to your poem, those are all types of figurative language. So more specifically, similes are comparing two objects that are not normally alike at all, and they're using them to compare them using like or as. So for example, I might say, his temper was as fragile as Venetian glass. Now, normally you would not compare Venetian glass, which is just fancy and very fragile glass, to someone's temper. Do you see how these two things are totally not alike? However, by comparing them using like or as, saying that one is like the other, we are giving the reader the intention that this man's temper is really fragile. We might want to be very careful about it. He might go off on us pretty easily, just like Venetian glass might break pretty easily, right? You could also use a metaphor. A metaphor is comparing two things that are normally not alike, but instead of saying like or as, you just say that one is the other. So instead of saying his temper was as fragile as Venetian glass, you can say his temper is a Venetian glass vase, right? So you're still saying the same thing. You're still getting the same sentiment across, but we call that a metaphor because you say one is the other. Okay. Water is life. We normally don't compare water and life, but by making this metaphor, by making this comparison, you are imparting to your reader how important water is. Okay. Finally, we have personification for the figurative language. Personification is when you give non human objects human qualities or characteristics. So, for example, I don't know why I always think of this, but I think of Beauty and the Beast and all of the non-human objects that all of a sudden take on human characteristics in that movie because of the curse, right? But in poetry, you're not going to have the images, you're going to have the words. So, for example, we can go back even to our imagery example, the wind howled. Now, normally wind does not howl. That is something that humans can do. We can howl, right? But by giving the wind that personified characteristic, we're bringing to life that that object in the poem. Once you've identified and gone through and analyzed the figurative language, you can move on to the T in our SIFT, and that's the tone and theme. Okay. After you've analyzed all of the symbols, imagery, and figurative language, a theme should be making its way out to you. But before we get to the theme, I want you guys to analyze the tone of the poem. The tone is the attitude that the author has about the topic. It is not how you feel reading the poem, it's the attitude of the author. And you know the attitude of the author by the words that they use. If they're using really positive, connotative words, then they probably feel pretty positive about the poem, the theme of the poem. If they're using really dark, negative, connotative words, then they're probably feeling pretty negative about the poem or the topic of the poem. Okay? So you want to take a look at what words the author is using. What words are the poet using? Because that's going to tell you their tone. Finally, you guys are going to determine the theme. This is sometimes subjective, especially with poetry. It is an art form and the poet sometimes leaves it open to interpretation. And so there really is no right or wrong answer. There really only is, can you support your answer with the symbols, imagery, figurative language, and tone of the poem? So when you think of the theme, you want to think about what the overall message is that the poet is trying to portray to the reader. Okay. This is really best done after you've analyzed symbols, imagery, figurative language, and tone. Once you've come up with all of that, you should be able to see pretty easily what the overall theme is to you. Again, this could be subjective to you, so there really is no right or wrong answer. There is only, can you support it with evidence of symbols, images, or imagery, or figurative language and tone? All right, so we're going to go ahead and use the next following slides to help us out with gathering some more information about each of these aspects of SIFT, and then you are going to apply it to some poems. Thank you.